time we're children to the time that we die, humans are inherently familiar with the concept of justice. In fact, much of the original developments in political philosophy and even philosophy in general are based around the idea of punishment and understanding what is the fair way to distribute punishment. Today, we're going to be talking about what we think punishment is, why we think that humans have such a fascination with it, and possibly what are the optimal systems of distributing it. Welcome to Collective Conscious, episode 11 out of infinity, where we talk about topics in philosophy, psychology, politics as they relate to the shared human experience. I am Tyler, here as always with my friend Junwei. And as always, Junwei, we're going to get it started with you. What are your thoughts going into this topic?
So I'm going to take a pretty theoretical approach first on this topic, and I thought that in my research, the utilitarianism perspective was pretty appealing just because it's something that utilitarianism is something that everyone can understand pretty easily, intuitively. So I'm going to approach it from that perspective first.
Sure.
So from their perspective, they punish people when the cost of punishment in terms of utility are outweighed by the gains in utility by punishment. So, when that and from that logic, then we should punish people. And there's three common ways in which this might be the case. And the first reason is it's a pure cost benefit. So, like, for example, when you're locking up a violent criminal in order to protect society from further violence, the costs of him are pretty great, but given his tendency towards violence, the benefits of removing him from the community far exceed the cost to that individual person. And the second reason is deterrence, which everyone knows what that is if you just know basic criminal theory. But what's really, I'll make this interesting note about deterrence is that, like, what's really interesting about deterrence is that it may not actually require that a punishment be actually used, as just by knowing you might get punished, the crime might not occur. So utilitarians especially favor deterrence because theoretically, not only does it lower the overall crime rate, but it often does so by imposing minimal punishment theoretically. And the last one would be rehabilitation, which is my personal favorite. But also, I would wager that utilitarians also favor this one too. As while on the surface, rehabilitation may look similar to deterrence, as they both try to stop criminals from committing crimes. The difference is the motive behind it. For deterrence, the individual is simply afraid to commit the crime, while for rehabilitation, the individual no longer wants to commit the crime. So this is just a brief, theoretical overview of why do we punish people.
So you'd say you primarily agree with the latter of those three reasons, or
Uh,
I'm not sure if
yeah,
agree is even the right word, but you would say that that's in your mind, the optimal motivation for punishment in general.
I think it's the optimal mode, and honestly, like, if you really press me for a reason, I can. I mean, I can give a reason, but it just feels. It's kind of like the feeling. It feels the most right to me for some reason.
Yeah, I actually think that's an important point to make, is the feeling that we get about the concept of punishment. Because for me, punishment is a deeply psychological phenomenon. It's not purely something that we invented through development of philosophy. For me, punishment, the philosophy behind punishment and criminal justice have been as much discovered as they have been developed, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
So how do you like, you mentioned, or you might mention, like, the social norms aspect to it?
Yeah. Before we were, for reference, before we started recording this podcast, I said very quickly to Junwei, I think there are some parallels between this episode and the one we did about social norms, which was episode number 2, for those who are curious. And so the reason that I said that to you was because I think that the concept of this desire for punishment, or desire for living in a system wherein there is punishment, is something that was not purely invented as a means of creating an optimal society. I think that it was ingrained within us in some sense. Let me put it into terms of just simple games that people play, because I think the human brain is, first of all, very, very attuned to understanding and playing games all the time. You know how much I love game theory because I talk about it all the time. Um, I think that a lot of the things we do can easily be classified as games. We're always playing with other people. In my mind, almost every single conversation even is a form of a game. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, game theory can be applied to pretty much anything in life, right?
Yeah, pretty much anything. Maybe that's why I love it so much. I'm having conversations with my family. I'm constantly thinking about my utility function for each conversation. Maybe not. But anyways, so the point that I was trying to make was almost everything that we do can be classified in one way or another as a game. And I think the human brain is very tuned in, not necessarily consciously, but at least subconsciously, to that mode of thinking. And I think one of the things that comes out of that is this idea that you want to create a system. So let's call the system that we're in, which could be like a political system, a justice system, governmental system, the sort of structure of society. Call that entire thing a game. We're all playing within it all the time because we live in this society. We live in a society. Good meme. Not really. But what we're constantly, in my mind, trying to do is figure out the optimal rules for that game so that we can all accomplish as much as we want to accomplish, essentially maximize our own utility functions. And for me, that ties in actually pretty nicely with your concept of utilitarian, well, not your concept of utilitarianism, unless you're a lot older than I thought you were. We're always trying to manipulate the rules to best benefit us. One of the things that comes along with that is actually being able to create consequences for those who break the rules. And I think it's really, in essence, from that we derive in some sense, our lust for justice. I really do think that humans have an intrinsic desire for justice. We're always trying to figure out what's fair. You hear the word fairness thrown around all the time, especially in politics. Fairness. What's fair? People paying their fair share. People doing doing time. We consider it a fairness thing, like eye for an eye almost. I'd like to think in some sense maybe we've developed in the last couple thousand years beyond just simple eye for an eye. But in many ways things have stayed the same.
So, I want to expand on your original point about that punishment is, while it may be on the surface like something that we do, like we like to believe that we have punishment because like it can better society and it's like optimal for society to function with punishment. But there's another side to the coin, which is like, as you mentioned, that we punish because like we like the feeling of getting justice, right? So you mentioned that like we have this like internal, I believe that we have an internal inherent desire to see people get punished, or like, like karma, right? Like it's like
Absolutely.
people love when like people get their karma, right? Even like I like to reference Reddit a lot because I think it's not the best representation of like people, but it's like still a decent representation of people. And there's this subreddit called Justice Porn, and it says everything
I've
you
seen
need to
that
know.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I've been on it a couple of times.
I mean, yeah, just you can see from the sentiments in the comments and how people react to stuff like that is just you get a really, I don't know if it's like a true fulfillment. Like, I get a different sense of fulfillment when I see someone get pulled over because they deserve to be pulled over, rather than like fulfillment for my work. It's just a different kind of like feels good, but it's not. It's like a like revenge. Like it's similar to revenge, basically. Like how you feel when you get revenge on someone.
It's a really deep feeling, and I know the feeling because I'll tell a quick story. Back in late high school, sometime around late high school, I was starting to get really into professional soccer, and I was watching this video of highlights from most people who would know soccer will know what game I'm talking about, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's irrelevant. Manchester City winning the Premier League in 2011 on the last match day. Well, one of the parts of that match was this dude who's like notoriously got a short fuse. His name is Joey Barton. Part of the match, he gets sent off, like he gets a red card for, I think it was either kicking or punching someone for absolutely no reason. Like after the whistle had already gone, it was just completely unjustified. And I specifically remember this feeling I got when I saw that, of just pure anger like boiling inside of me. And I remember even at the time thinking to myself, like, wow, that was a really strong sort of intrinsic reaction to that. that must have been really deep rooted. And I think that's within all of us to some degree, maybe to varying degrees. But I do think that it's this deep feeling within us that we want a sense of what is fair. I think what it comes down to is fairness. I think that's probably interchangeable with justice.
If it's such a deep, if we both agree that's a really deep, rooted feeling we have in ourselves and maybe even biological to some degree. So I'm curious what your thoughts on like what evolutionary purpose does like fairness serve? I mean, intuitively we can probably have a lot of reasons for it, but I'm curious on what you got to say to that.
Yeah. Well, I think let's go back to the social norms thing. One of the things that I think, agreed on was that one of the main function of social norms is to essentially minimize the amount of conflict necessary, right? And I think justice in a lot of ways is the same way, and punishment specifically, even though it seems ironic, is sort of the same way. Going back to, you laid out those three possible motivations for punishment earlier, and the second one was deterrent. And I think that's primarily what it comes down to from an evolutionary sense is if you have a system where everybody is willing to punish other people for breaking I'm doing air quotes, rules of the system, which we could just say are like the laws in a country, then it is far more unlikely that people are going to break those rules. And I really think that's in essence what it would come down to from a mathematical / game theory point of view.
I think that's a really good point, and I wanted to reference your thought experiment from I think it wasn't a social norms episode, but it was actually the human rights episode, and you mentioned a thought experiment where if two people are stuck on a desert island or whatever, and like, do human rights still exist in that island? And so I want to like pretty much shift that thought experiment to punishment, which is like, if there's two people stuck on an island, like, does punishment still exist in that quote unquote society?
Yeah. I guess it would be kind of tough because like how would you do, punishment among two people is just one person kind of beating on the other at that point. But I understand your point. And I think that at that point, no, it doesn't really serve a purpose. It's two people interacting with each other. Maybe you can have like micro punishments for one behavior or another if you're forced to be in close proximity or you're forcibly dependent on each other for one reason or another. But the concept of punishment as we see it, I don't think would exist, which I know goes against what I said in the human rights episode.
So, I mean, maybe two people is too low because that kind of conflates the thought experiment and kind of messes it up. But what if like what do you think the number is? Like what number do we need to like for punishment to like exist in that kind of island?
All right, this is gonna sound like a cop-out answer, but 3.
I mean, I figured that was the case because, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's one of those sort of peculiar things where the minimal number is not 1 or 2. It just happens to be 3, which is not the case for most things. Usually it would be 1 or 2 people.
Isn't that's actually like really interesting when you think about it. Like this is one of the cases where like the number is like 3 and not 1 or 2.
Yeah, maybe we're both wrong though. Well, what's your point of view? I'll just turn the question back on you. In a system where you can choose either 2 or 3 people exist on some island, does the concept of punishment change in your mind, or does it pretty much stay the same?
It's a really hard question. I mean, like with 2 people, it's one person is dependent on the other or vice versa, and so like internally, I don't see what function of punishment would serve rather than just like the justice feel good. Like I can still see that as an appeal to have punishment in that system, but and when you add 3 people, now you sort of have like, I think maybe the concept of like having a majority rule, like that kind of concept. I think that might have a big factor into why we think 3 is the optimal number or the minimal number.
Yeah. So do you think the laws that you would enact, or I don't even want to put it in terms of laws, but the sort of, and I'm using air quotes again, rules for punishment would pretty much stay the same in that microsystem as it would if you were designing it for a much larger scale, or would it be much different?
I mean, with that kind of like such a when you scale it down so small like that, I don't know how punishment would really work because that requires for almost every country has a legal system, and how do you just like for three people like have a legal system, like you are the population, like you are everything basically, like how do you enforce that, like what's fair and how do you
You could
decide?
have
It's just
a jury of like squirrels maybe or birds. I don't know.
we
One
should we
chirp
should we
for
should do that
guilty,
in
two chirp
in
for
real life.
innocent. Yeah. Animals aren't as biased as humans, so they should be the
Exactly.
jurors, not humans. I think this might actually be pretty revolutionary.
Let's put it out there.
I'll write the paper. But yeah, I think, I mean, it's this is just beyond punishment on its own, sort of a general test I would give myself for any sort of policy is that I think it should be able to scale down in general. There are of course like the more logistical problems, like what we were just talking about with the jury, like how do you have a jury if there's only three people total? But I think in general, policies should be able to scale down appropriately. Like I don't think there are many philosophically consistent policies that only work at a certain population level. To me, that and I'm not the political science major, so I'm not going to say that I know everything about poli sci or political philosophy, but it seems to me that things should work regardless of scale for the most part.
I mean, that seems to be right. Just we want to be consistent with your theory. So like, if it works for three people, it should work for 100. It should work for a million. So I can get on board with that. And so actually, I want to go back to the idea of the idea of revenge. And so I want to actually found this thought experiment online, which was pretty interesting. And
Mhm.
so it goes like this. Someone has committed a murder, they have admitted to it, and a jury of their peers has found them guilty. So, but if you knew for a fact, and like, so if you knew for a fact that the person would never commit murder again and would pose no threat to society in any way, should this person be punished, like go to prison for the murder?
Yeah, it's a good thought experiment. I've thought about that before. And I think for me the answer is yes, because it comes down to what I was saying before. It's the deterrent and what you said even before that. Um, Part of the function of punishment is deterring people, not just cost benefit of that individual person. I mean, you really just can't view punishment in a criminal justice system as isolated cases. People see what happens and they react based off that. The system is not static. It evolves with every decision that's made.
What if you change it so that like no one knows about it? Well,
If no one knows about it,
I guess that wouldn't make a lot of sense, but
well, let's just say it is possible. If no one knows about it, like essentially the case is a complete secret, nobody knows that it even happened, nobody knows that the murder happened, then yeah, if you had some way of being 100% certain that they wouldn't do it again, then yes, I would say that they should not go to jail essentially. But
okay,
at that
yeah.
point, you're making a lot of assumptions that are pretty much impossible.
Yeah, I guess the main I guess for I mean, I do agree with you, like the main fundamental problem with this thought experiment is just like it's just other people can follow his footsteps and you don't want that happening.
Yeah. Well, what are your thoughts about the same thought experiment?
I mean, yeah, I agree with your initial premise that like even though if there's a guarantee that he would pose no threat to society, there's a pretty good chance that other people can see his actions for what they are and be like, oh, I can get away with this too. And I think deterrence is like one of the main fundamental like just strong just roots of like punishment and why we need punishment in the first place.
Yeah. I do want to make a point though that deterrence can't be the only motivation because if that were the case, then you would just like kill people for every crime, because you would be essentially proving a point. I'm doing air quotes again. I wish I could show that I was doing air quotes over audio. Anyways, you'd be constantly, proving a point per se, if someone is at risk of being hanged for stealing an apple, yeah, no one's going to steal apples. Doesn't make that the optimal system. So I do want to make a distinction between punishment for the sake of deterrence and over punishing.
Right, and I think that you know, you hear in the U.S., especially in the United States justice system, about like how a lot of people have this notion that our prison system is very flawed, and you know, I can't say I'm too like I don't really know much about this topic to really say correctly if it's correct or not. But it seems like rehabilitation we have not really like done that well in our society.
Doesn't seem to be the case. However, I'm not sure. I'm not going to say I'm the most educated person on this either, just as a disclaimer, but I'm not sure that that's fully the fault of the criminal justice system so much as it is the fault of things that come far before the criminal justice system. And by that, I mean far before in those people's lives, those people as in like the criminals, essentially. This is kind of a depressing statistic, but you can actually predict to a pretty high level of certainty whether someone will eventually engage in violent criminal activity later in their life by the time that they're about the age of 4 or 5.
What are the factors that go into that?
Basically, what it comes down to is antisocial behavior. So that's not to say that antisocial behavior is the cause necessarily, but it is a sign, and it's at least correlated. And so for me, it's almost pointless to try rehabilitation at the point in time where they're already out committing crimes. It would probably be far more effective to have some sort of, you won't even call it rehabilitation at that point, but criminal prevention between the ages of 0 and 5. But, you know, as soon as those words come out of my mouth, a ton of fear of these like authoritarian police regimes springing up using that as a motivation pops to mind. So it's a pretty slippery slope, I would say, too, to try to do these criminal prevention programs for kids who are not even 5 years old yet. But it's kind of a scary thought that maybe you're almost destined to that future by the time you don't even understand it.
So that like my first thought is like that just brings up the whole free will determinism argument, which we will not touch on this episode because it's entirely for its own episode. But I also just like to say that your concept of, you know, preventing punishment from 0 to 5 and all that controversy behind that sounds like a great plot for like a dystopian book.
Exactly. You know, it's kind of similar to, have you ever seen Minority Report?
I've seen it once, yeah.
Yeah, so I saw it like a super long time ago, so I don't remember the plot that well. But the concept is that I think they're called cogs or precogs. They can predict when someone is going to commit a crime, and so they can go and arrest the person beforehand. That's a pretty scary dystopian future, and that's pretty much what we'd be talking about if we're looking at these criminal prevention programs before 0 and 5. And if it's not something like that, then it's probably something more like brainwashing. But, you know, the scary thought is, and it wouldn't surprise me if countries like China especially are doing stuff like this, but just running AI machine learning models to try to predict exactly what citizens are going to be committing crimes and then surveilling them before they even do anything. If that's already going on, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Actually, you know what? I'd honestly be surprised if it wasn't already going on, especially in a country like China.
Oh, I'd be surprised too if they didn't already have this implemented, like at least the foundations of this model.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really a pretty big just going about this, right?
Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on something like that? Would you say that it's justified, a system where crime is essentially being predicted and then acted upon before it's really done?
I mean, yeah, that's just I mean, I would have to know like how exactly it would work and like, you know, what problems it can potentially have. But I would say like the main thing is, I mean, the one of the important questions to ask is like, does society know that like the government has that feature, or are they just living their normal lives as they are?
Yeah, that would be a pretty important part. I mean, I would lean towards the side of, even if they do know, probably not supporting something like that, or almost certainly not supporting something like that. I'm not even gonna make my opinion hesitant. But yeah, there is a pretty big distinction between if it's happening and citizens know about it, and if it's happening and they don't know about it. But I don't want to get too deep into the like this little rabbit hole. But in China, they already have something called the social credit system. Have you heard of that?
I've heard about it, but you can explain it for the audience.
Yeah, sure. So it's basically, I'm going to put it in really simple terms because I don't know the exact details of specifically how it works, but essentially what it is assigning each citizen a score, as in a numerical score of their, I don't even know what the right word would be, but essentially compliance within society. And so what you can do with that is you can prefer people with higher scores for various things like loans, getting a plane ticket even. You can use that to just judge people at all times. Imagine a world where people's scores are just projected right above their heads electronically. Like you can always see everybody's score for the people that are walking around you. That's pretty
That's
scary.
that's one of the most well-known Black Mirror episodes, if you've seen that one.
No, I've only watched like 2 episodes of Black Mirror.
Oh yeah, it's just the concept behind that episode was like everyone has a score above their heads, and that determines whether they can, as you said, like whether they can have access to certain things and like what things affects their like employment and like pretty much everything in life. So it's a really like fun
Damn.
concept
So
to
that's
think
like
about.
the exact same thing basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if they were inspired for that episode by the Chinese system, because the Chinese system has been like, it's been known about for a little while now, like multiple years. Do you know when the episode came out?
Pretty recently, like maybe like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
3 years.
Yeah, I wonder if it was inspired by that at all. It's interesting. Back to the idea of justice and punishment though. It's really a slippery slope when you're trying to essentially pre-punish people. I don't think that I don't feel personally that there's much of a justification for pre-punishment, but prevention could be a different story. But it's also a slippery slope. I mean, how much are you intruding on people's lives? And assuming they have free will, how much are you justified in manipulating their free will? I mean, if someone's going to be a criminal, right? Do you have the right to try to manipulate them just so that they don't become a criminal? What if they would actually want to be? What if they would prefer that?
Yeah, that goes like pretty much. That brings us another question about like what rights does the government have to like at what point does it become like overbearing in terms of like interfering with like a basic right to whatever?
Exactly, exactly. And it's in addition to the fact that it's the government itself that determines the laws. So if the government is determining the laws and then also has this program to ensure that all citizens are compliant within those laws, damn, that sounds like a lot of power, even if they're not strictly speaking punishing anyone.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the thought experiment of pre-punishing people and whether society knows about it or not, and let's assume, so for the assumption that society does know about it, it kind of reminds me of like the NSA and tracking people's cell phones. Like we all know like maybe they do it, and it's kind of that, but like in a more like
Not maybe.
severe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's you know what, actually that reminds me. I saw my dad told me about this story from a few days ago. Um as we talked about in our last episode, just for reference, we're in the midst of this whole coronavirus thing right now. As of recording this, which is, what is the date today? The 29th of March, 28th of March,
Mhm.
2020. Everybody's in this self quarantine state, just for reference. And my dad told me about a news story a few days ago about um, some third party organization released some data report about where people are, least compliant with the self quarantining thing using location data. And it's something that I was saying to him before, like they'll just start tracking the cell phone data. And, it's pretty easy for the NSA to covertly create something like what we were just talking about with the social credit system in China. We could be in the exact same system and just be on the other side of whether citizens know about it or not.
Man, sounds scary.
It does sound scary. Not trying to sound like Alex Jones or anything though.
Yeah.
Do you know Alex Jones, by the way? I don't want to that reference to just like go over your head and you be confused about it.
This is another reference I don't understand. So yeah,
All right, I'll explain it real quickly. Alex Jones is basically this. I'll say this: he's been vindicated about a lot of things, but he is known as this sort of like right-wing conspiracy nut. So I'm not trying to say like the NSA is tapping into all our phones and manipulating us, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I'll just leave it at that.
gotcha. I'll have to stay up to date with more current events.
Yeah, man, you got to keep up. No, it's there's some pretty freaky stuff going on out there that we just don't know about. But
Yeah.
as bad as it sounds, a lot of it we're probably better off not knowing about, quite frankly. But back to the concept of punishment real quick before we end this episode. One thing that I want to talk about is a sort of different use of the word punishment, which is in the context of conditioning from psychology, reward versus punishment, that sort of thing. And I think that's also sort of a key concept that's ingrained within us, but is slightly different from the concept of like criminal punishment. It's the type of thing that parents are doing to their kids all the time. It's just sort of a corrective mechanism for behavior. And I think it's essentially a similar idea to the concept of criminal punishment, but on a much smaller scale.
Yeah. Over just watching some things is just like about reinforcement, which is negative reinforcement is a lot stronger than positive reinforcement. Like how much of an effect it has on you to change, and negative just has a lot stronger. So like one example I would to bring up is like if you're eating at a restaurant and this is your favorite restaurant and you go there almost like weekly to get your favorite food, and one day you eat it and you go home and you get food poisoning and ruins your entire experience. Like after that, it's like one negative event out of like 200 that prevents you from like going to the restaurant ever again. So that I would just say like the comment that negative reinforcement is a lot stronger than positive reinforcement.
Yeah, that's probably why we're so eager to use it. We understand ourselves, which means that we understand other people, and to some extent. So, the strategies we use to manipulate other people are probably just the strategies that we would use on ourselves if we could use them on ourselves. But
yeah, so to wrap this up, Tyler, like I mean, we usually have like takeaways from these episodes, and so because like with the takeaways are usually associated with like things we can apply to our daily lives, and I'm kind of like stuck on what to even like what should we take away from like knowing punishment and like what we discussed today.
You know what? This is probably one of the toughest episodes to come up with a natural takeaway for our daily lives. So I
Yeah,
would say I would limit it to this. It would be understand that our sort of lust for justice, I'm going to call it, is very much an intrinsic thing. It's not something that we invented. Our criminal justice system is as much something, in all likelihood, that we've discovered as much as we have invented. And so if there's really one takeaway, it's just to probably to understand that a lot of these things are built into us. They're not going to change. And so this whole concept of like revolutionizing an entire system, in some ways it's a little naive to think that you can just uproot this entire system. It's not as if we just created it out of thin air. It's been developed over many, many, many years. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it doesn't mean you can just start at ground zero and hope to create something nearly as effective. So maybe that's not so much a takeaway for someone's daily life, but at least something to think about.
so
How
that's a
about
good
you,
way
Juma?
to wrap it up.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that then. Like I said, this was definitely a tougher episode to come up with a good takeaway for. But you know what? I'm okay with the challenge. This is still a fun one to think about leading up to it. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a much of a daily life takeaway. As you said, it's pretty hard to come up with something that's like not purely theoretical, but a lot of the things we talked about are theoretical. So um, maybe my takeaway, if I had to come up with one, is just I guess no, there's a difference between like getting revenge on someone for the sake of it and actually like uh making of punishment. Like there's a big difference between those two things.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to wrap it up. I think you did an all right job there, buddy.
Thanks.
All right, so episode 11, Collective Conscious. This has been Tyler and Junwei, my friend. Thanks for listening.